Somewhere beneath the modern streets of Alexandria, Egypt, archaeologists still search for a building that changed the course of human knowledge, and then vanished so completely that historians cannot agree on how, or even exactly when, it died. For 7 centuries, it was the greatest concentration of human thought ever assembled in one place. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and literature of the ancient Mediterranean world, gathered under one royal roof by kings who believed that owning every book on earth was a form of power. Scholars traveled for months to read there. Ships docked in its harbor and were searched, not for contraband, but for books, which were seized, copied, and only sometimes returned. And then, in a story tangled by 2,000 years of blame, rumor, and rewriting, it burned. Or it decayed. Or it was murdered by mobs, by emperors, by conquerors, depending on who was telling the story, and who they wanted the villain to be. What actually happened inside the Library of Alexandria is one of history's most persistent mysteries, not because the evidence is silent, but because too many people, across too many centuries, have tried to make it speak. Tonight, we separate the legend from the record, and follow the library from its glittering birth to its long, disputed death. In the last years of the 4th century BCE, the world that Alexander the Great had shattered by conquest was still settling into new shapes. Alexander himself was dead, felled by fever or poison in Babylon in 323 BCE, and his generals, the men historians would later call the Diadochi, the successors, were carving his empire into pieces. One of those generals was Ptolemy, a Macedonian nobleman who had marched with Alexander since boyhood. Ptolemy's prize was Egypt, the wealthiest and most defensible of the conquered lands, and the city he made his capital was one Alexander himself had founded on the Mediterranean coast in 331 BCE, Alexandria. Alexandria was built with startling intention. Its streets were laid out on a grid. Its harbor was guarded, eventually, by the Pharos lighthouse, a structure so towering it would be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And at its heart, Ptolemy I Soter and his successors planned something without precedent, an institution devoted entirely to the accumulation and study of knowledge, built not for one nation's memory but for the memory of everything. The institution had a name that has outlived its walls, the Mouseion, a shrine to the Muses, the goddesses of art and inspiration. It was not simply a library in the way we imagine one today. It was closer to a research academy, a place where the state paid salaries to scholars, provided them room and board, and asked in return only that they think, calculate, translate, and write. Attached to the Mouseion, either as its central feature or as a building close beside it, was the library itself, a repository intended, in the most literal sense its founders could manage, to hold a copy of every book in the world. The scale of the ambition is difficult to overstate. Ancient sources, admittedly inconsistent and sometimes given to exaggeration, describe collections ranging from 200,000 to as many as 700,000 papyrus scrolls. Even the more conservative estimates would have made the Library of Alexandria the largest single collection of texts the ancient world had ever seen, dwarfing the libraries of Athens, of Pergamon, of anywhere else scholars gathered to read. How does an ancient state acquire that many books? Partly through purchase, with royal agents dispatched across the Mediterranean to buy up private libraries and rare texts wherever they surfaced. Partly through diplomacy and coercion in equal measure. Later writers describe a policy, whether entirely true or embellished with time, in which every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was subject to search. If books were found aboard, they were confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copies, not the originals, were returned to their owners. The originals stayed in Alexandria. Scholars have since nicknamed these seized texts the ship's books, a phrase that captures both the audacity and the slight absurdity of a state so hungry for scrolls that it would raid its own visitors' luggage. The Ptolemies did not stop at piracy dressed up as scholarship. One often told account, transmitted through later writers rather than eyewitnesses, describes Ptolemy III borrowing the official Athenian copies of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, under the pretense of copying them, and posting an enormous financial deposit as security for their return. When the copies were finished, the story goes, Alexandria kept the originals, forfeited the deposit, and sent copies back to Athens instead. Whether every detail of this tale is literally accurate or partly legend built around a real transaction, it captures something true about how the library was perceived even in antiquity, as an institution willing to bend any rule in pursuit of completeness. What the Ptolemies built with all of this was not merely a warehouse of scrolls but a machine for producing knowledge. The scholars housed at the Mouseion were given the resources, the time, and, crucially, the comparative texts to do work that simply could not be done anywhere else. Alexandria became the place where the mathematician Euclid organized geometry into the logical, axiom-based system that would be taught, essentially unchanged, for the next 2,000 years. It was where Eratosthenes, serving for a time as the library's chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the earth using nothing more than the angle of shadows at noon in two different cities and a chain of assumptions so elegant it still impresses students today, and arrived at a figure startlingly close to the true value. It was where Herophilus and Erasistratus performed some of the first systematic anatomical studies in the Western tradition, work that later medical writers would draw on for centuries. It was where astronomers tracked the movements of planets, where geographers drew maps of a world larger and stranger than the one any single traveler had seen, and where Greek scholars, working alongside Jewish translators, produced the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that would later shape both Jewish diaspora communities and, eventually, early Christian scripture itself. The chief librarians of Alexandria were themselves towering intellectual figures, not mere administrators. Xenodotus of Ephesus, the first to hold the post under Ptolemy II, undertook the immense task of establishing a standard, corrected text of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, sorting through the many variant versions circulating across the Greek world and attempting to determine, as best the evidence allowed, which lines were authentic. Later librarians, including Callimachus, went further still. Callimachus is credited with compiling the Pinox, a monumental bibliographic catalogue that organized the library's holdings by genre and author, complete with short biographical notes, arguably the ancestor of every library catalogue and encyclopedic reference work that followed. Apollonius of Rhodes, another librarian, was himself a celebrated poet, the author of the epic Argonautica. This was, in other words, an institution run not by clerks but by the leading minds of its age, each adding their own contribution to the accumulating structure of Western scholarship, for roughly 2.5 centuries, through the reigns of Ptolemy I, II, and III in particular. Alexandria's intellectual machine ran at extraordinary output. The city drew scholars from across the Hellenistic world, from Sicily, from Asia Minor, from Cyrene, from Judea, men who came for the resources and the royal patronage and, perhaps as much as anything, for the company of other minds working on the same unsolved problems. It is worth pausing on what this meant in practical terms. In a world without printing, without postal networks, without any reliable way to know what a scholar 300 miles away had already discovered, Alexandria offered something almost unimaginable elsewhere, a place where nearly everything that had been written down could, in principle, be checked, compared, and cross-referenced in one location. The very possibility of certain kinds of systematic knowledge, comprehensive geography, standardized texts, comparative anatomy, depended on a concentration of documents that existed almost nowhere else on earth, but institutions built on royal patronage carry the fragility of royal patronage within them. By the later Ptolemaic period, the dynasty had grown increasingly turbulent, marked by fratricide, palace intrigue, and dynastic warfare between siblings and cousins contesting the throne. Ptolemy I, in the mid-2nd century BCE, is recorded as having expelled foreign scholars from Alexandria during a political purge, a decision ancient sources suggest scattered some of the library's intellectual talent to rival centers such as Pergamon and Rhodes, even as the institution itself continued to function. The library survived these convulsions, but the golden, uninterrupted flowering of its earliest century had already begun to give way to something more precarious. It was into this weakened, still magnificent city that Rome eventually arrived, not as a conqueror at first, but as an interested party drawn into Egypt's internal politics. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar came to Alexandria pursuing his defeated rival Pompey and found himself entangled instead in a succession dispute between the co-ruling siblings Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar sided with Cleopatra. Ptolemy's forces, backed by a much larger army, besieged Caesar's comparatively small contingent within the palace quarter of the city, trapping him near the harbor. What happened next is the single most famous episode in the library story, and also the one most thoroughly reshaped by centuries of retelling. To prevent the enemy fleet from escaping or reinforcing, Caesar ordered ships in the harbor set ablaze. It was, by most surviving accounts, a tactical decision made under siege pressure, not an act aimed at the library itself. But Alexandria's waterfront district was dense, and fire in antiquity did not respect the boundaries planners intended. The flames spread from the ships to dockside warehouses and buildings along the shore. Here the ancient sources begin to diverge, and it is worth sitting with that divergence rather than smoothing it away. The biographer Plutarch, writing more than a century after the events he describes, states plainly that the fire consumed the library. The historian Cassius Dio, writing later still, in the early 3rd century CE, refers instead to the burning of storehouses containing books, using a word that does not necessarily mean the royal library as an institution, and that some modern historians read as referring to a separate stockpile of scrolls awaiting export or shipment, rather than the Mouseian central collection. Other contemporary or near-contemporary writers who might have been expected to mention such a catastrophe, including Cicero, who was alive at the time and deeply engaged with the intellectual world Alexandria represented, say nothing about it at all. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: some quantity of books was destroyed in Alexandria in 48 BCE, in a fire connected to Caesar's siege. What cannot be said with confidence is that this event by itself ended the Library of Alexandria as an institution. Evidence exists that intellectual life, royal patronage of scholars, and library activity in the city continued for generations afterward. The philosopher and geographer Strabo, visiting Alexandria roughly 2 decades later, describes the Mouseion as a functioning institution, still housing scholars, though he is notably vague about the state of its library holdings, a silence some historians read as significant, and others as simply incidental. Later Roman emperors are recorded taking an interest in Alexandria's libraries. The philosopher and biographer Suetonius credits the emperor Domitian, more than a century after Caesar, with sending scribes to Alexandria specifically to copy texts and replenish Rome's own libraries after a fire, evidence, however indirect, that Alexandria's collections still held enormous value as a source to copy from. Whatever damage 48 BCE had inflicted, the truth that emerges from the tangled sources is not A single dramatic bonfire, but something more sobering. A long, uneven decline, punctuated by real disasters, none of which alone delivers the final blow, and all of which together eventually do. There is also the complicating fact, established by careful modern scholarship, that Alexandria was home to more than one library. Alongside the royal library of the Mouse-Ion stood what ancient writers call a daughter library, housed within the Serapeum, the great temple complex dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis, a deity the Ptolemies had deliberately cultivated to bridge Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. The Serapeum's library appears to have functioned as a more publicly accessible collection, in contrast to the more restricted, scholar-focused Mouse-Ion library, and it endured, through fires, through political turbulence, for centuries after the Mouse-Ion's fortunes had faded. It was the Serapeum, and its library, that met its own well-documented catastrophe in 391 CE. In circumstances that had nothing to do with siege warfare and everything to do with the religious transformation sweeping the late Roman Empire. By this point, Christianity had become the empire's dominant and increasingly privileged faith, and the Emperor Theodosius I had issued edicts restricting, and in places banning, traditional pagan worship. In Alexandria, tensions between the city's Christian community, led by the Bishop Theophilus, and its remaining pagan population erupted into open confrontation. According to the ancient accounts, the Serapeum, a fortress-like temple that had also become a refuge for besieged pagans, was stormed, and on Theophilus's orders, the temple was destroyed and a church was raised on its ruins. Whether the library housed within the Serapeum still held a significant collection of scrolls by 391, after centuries of decline, or was by then a much diminished remnant of its former self, is a question the surviving evidence cannot fully answer. What is not disputed is that the Serapeum itself, the temple that had sheltered Alexandria's daughter library for centuries, was physically destroyed in that year, and that this destruction marked the effective end of institutional library life at that site. Nearly 2 decades before that, in 272 or 273 CE, another episode of violence had already struck the city and, quite possibly, the Mouse-Ion's district directly. The Roman Emperor Aurelian, campaigning to reclaim Alexandria from forces aligned with the breakaway Palmyrene Empire led by Queen Zenobia, recaptured the city after a hard fight and, in the process, inflicted severe damage on the Brucheian, the royal quarter where the Mouse-Ion and its original library had stood since the days of the first Ptolemy. Ancient sources are frustratingly thin on the precise fate of the library buildings in this campaign, but the destruction of the Brucheian quarter itself is well attested, and many modern historians consider Aurelian's reconquest, rather than Caesar's fire 3 centuries earlier, the more likely moment when the original Mouse-Ion library, if any substantial remnant of it still existed by the 3rd century, was finally and physically erased from the map. By the time these 3rd and 4th century catastrophes had run their course, the Library of Alexandria as the Ptolemies had conceived it, a single, vast, state-funded repository intended to house all the world's knowledge under one royal roof, had already ceased to exist in any meaningful institutional sense. What remained afterward, into the 5th and 6th centuries, was Alexandria's continuing reputation as a center of learning, its famous catechetical school, its philosophers, including the mathematician and philosopher Hypatia, whose own murder by a Christian mob in 415 CE stands as another dark, contested chapter in the city's late antique intellectual life, distinct from but often folded into the library's larger legend, which brings the story, finally, to its most persistent and most thoroughly debunked myth, the claim that the Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 CE delivered the library's final destruction, on the personal order of the Caliph Umar, who is said to have declared that any book agreeing with the Quran was redundant and any book disagreeing with it was heretical, and that the city's remaining scrolls fueled the furnaces of Alexandria's bathhouses for 6 months. This vivid story, still repeated today in casual retellings of the library's fate, does not appear in any source until roughly 5 centuries after the events it claims to describe. It surfaces first in the writings of a 13th-century Christian bishop, and virtually no contemporary historian regards it as reliable. As early as the 18th century, the historian Edward Gibbon dismissed the tale as implausible, noting the complete silence of earlier writers, both Arab and Byzantine, on an event that should have been impossible to overlook had it truly occurred as described. By the time Muslim forces took Alexandria in the 7th century, the library, in any organized institutional form, had already been gone for centuries, a casualty not of any single conqueror's fanaticism, but of accumulated fire, war, funding collapse, and the simple, unglamorous fragility of papyrus left too long without the resources to preserve it. Why, then, has the myth of a single villain, Caesar, or Theophilus, or Umar, depending on the century and the storyteller's agenda, proven so durable, when the historical reality is a slower, more distributed unraveling? Part of the answer lies in how each accusation served the political and religious needs of the age that repeated it. Christian writers in late antiquity found it useful to blame pagan-era neglect or Roman brutality. Enlightenment writers, wary of religious authority, found it useful to blame Christian mobs or Islamic conquerors. Each retelling tells us less about the actual 5th or 7th century than about the anxieties of the century doing the retelling, a pattern historians increasingly recognize across many ancient, great catastrophe stories, in which a real, gradual, multi-causal decline is compressed by later memory into a single dramatic act of destruction, easier to narrate and easier to blame. What the honest historical record supports is not a murder but something closer to a long illness with several relapses, a fire during a siege in 48 BCE that damaged some portion of the collection, a slow erosion of royal patronage as the Ptolemaic dynasty weakened and Rome absorbed Egypt as a province rather than a partner, the physical destruction of the Brucaean quarter during Aurelian's reconquest in the 270s, the demolition of the Serapeum and its daughter library amid religious conflict in 391, and finally, centuries of ordinary neglect, as papyrus, a material that decays readily in humidity and requires constant, expensive recopying to survive at all, was simply not renewed by institutions that had lost the will, the funding, or both, to sustain a project as extravagant as owning every book in the world. The loss, however it happened, was real, and its consequences echoed for centuries. We know of ancient works, histories, scientific treatises, poetic epics, that survive today only as fragments, or as titles mentioned in other authors' citations, or not at all, and it is impossible to know with certainty how much of that loss traces back to Alexandria's decline specifically versus the ordinary attrition that claimed the vast majority of all ancient literature, copied by hand and vulnerable to fire, flood, and simple forgetting, everywhere in the ancient world. What is certain is that no institution before or since has occupied quite the same symbolic place, a physical building that stood, for a few centuries, as a kind of promise, that human knowledge could be gathered, organized, and preserved in one place, protected by the wealth and will of a state that believed doing so was worth the cost. That promise, imperfectly kept and eventually broken, has outlived the building itself by more than 2,000 years. In 2002, a new library rose in Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, built with international funding not far from where scholars believe the ancient Mount Ion once stood, a modern institution consciously designed to evoke, without claiming to literally continue, the ambition of its ancient predecessor. It cannot restore what was lost. No one can measure precisely what disappeared in the fires of 48 BCE, in the ruins of the Brucheian after Aurelian's siege, or in the rubble of the Serapeum in 391. But the very fact that the modern world felt compelled to build a symbolic successor, on the same stretch of Mediterranean coastline, more than 16 centuries after the original's final decline, tells us something the ancient sources cannot, that the idea the Library of Alexandria represented, that all human knowledge deserves to be gathered, protected, and shared, never actually died at all. Only the building did.